So we've already learned a lot about Manchester and how Manchester tackles social issues this week. We're really delighted now to welcome Michael Linnell, who is one of the UK's leading experts in new psychoactive substances. He's been working in the field for 30 years. The session's going to be chaired by Kevin, who is the editor of Big Issue North. So I'll hand over to Kevin now, who's going to coordinate the chat. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. Good morning. Is everything working? Yep, good. Mike, welcome. 30 years ago or so, you graduated with a fine art degree and went into drug policy, drug communications, and a long career in that. How did that come about? And just tell me something about your current role as well, please.
Well, I was actually working as a comedy acrobat at the time in Cardiff, jumping off the top of a transit van headfirst into a bucket. And I had a fallout with two members of the Socialist Worker Party who were dressed as gorillas. And I was dressed as a chicken with a great big head and said, I'm not working for this organisation anymore, and walked out of the theatre with as much dignity as you can get when you've got big yellow feet and a chicken's head on you. So decided that I needed a job. So a drugs charity in Manchester, which at that time had about 12 staff, put an advert in the creative and media section of The Guardian saying they wanted an artist to work for a drugs charity. Nobody ever knew why, and they ended up with me. So 30 years later, I work for myself, and my current role is UK Drug Watch is a voluntary organisation that I coordinate. I also manage the drug early warning system for Greater Manchester that's been set up since March. And the rest of my time is taken up by doing research on various drugs and making animations on drugs and public health.
And we'll come back to new psychoactive substances and spice later on. But at the time, what were the main issues about drugs and how did you try to tackle them?
In the 80s, the really big issue in the 80s was HIV. Or as it was called when I started, HDLV3, before it was even HIV. And we saw that as an opportunity in that there was only, we weren't allowed to get away with certain things with what you could say on drugs publicly. But HIV was seen as a really serious threat. At that time, almost the opposite of the government in the United States. The UK government said that HIV was a bigger threat than drug misuse. So we used that to push forward the provision of needle exchange in Manchester. And on the back of that, we said, well, we're going to provide information predominantly about the risks of sharing syringes and injection equipment, but also other safety information aimed at drug users. Hence, it came about that we started producing information and booklets and comics for that group.
And the comics are a critical thing there as well, aren't they? Because they were a different form of communication than perhaps the UK had seen in terms of drug policy.
They were. I mean, the initial one I did was called Smack in the Eye. And nobody asked us to do it. We didn't have any funding for it. I drew it all on a pencil and paper, a little bit of ink. And what we decided, which was quite revolutionary at the time, is that rather than looking stuff up in books, what we would do is we would speak to the people who are actually using drugs. So we spoke to them first and said, well, what kind of things would be attractive to you? What would you read? What kind of information would be useful in what sort of format? And it was quite clear that one of the big things was that a sense of humour was needed within all this as well. So Smack in the Eye was designed with that target audience rather than being designed like most drugs education is, which is designed so it doesn't get the people who produce it into trouble with people who pay for it. We didn't have that barrier because nobody was funding us anyway, so we thought, fuck it, we'll go for it. And it's going to be controversial anyway, so we might as well ramp that up, because the more controversial, the more people who try to ban it, the more attractive it will become to our target audience of injecting drug users. So that's what we did.
And that issue of being banned, I mean, you were interviewed by the Director of Public Prosecutions with a view to prosecution, weren't you?
On a number of occasions.
How did that come about?
we were threatened with arrest. They were never quite sure what we were doing wrong, because we didn't break any pornography laws, because the laws are different if they're drawn images. But they were sure. I mean, we used to get moral outrage letters on a regular, it was along with fan mail from kind of like prisoners. And I think that the best way of summing it up was that they tried to prosecute some workers in Scotland for giving out copies of Smack in the Eye. And again, they couldn't find which law to prosecute them on. So they said that they tried to prosecute them on a law of depraving and corrupting by the use of a publication. So these Scottish workers got a barrister involved, and he successfully argued that the target audience for Smack in the Eye were already depraved and corrupted. So it was impossible to do it with this, salacious magazine full of showing people how to inject drugs and swearing and sex and rock and roll and everything else.
As well as being depraving and corrupting, you were also but telling a message of harm reduction rather than abstinence in drug use at the time, which I think was probably quite controversial in terms of coming up against the official line on drug policy.
It was. I mean, this was 1985. We held the first harm reduction meeting in the UK in what was one of the national offices called the ISDD at the time in London. And when they found out what it was, we were banned from the building. I mean, it was considered really controversial. But as I said, we used HIV to get away with what we were doing. It was obviously that was a major issue, but it was also about giving advice about overdose, giving advice about all kinds of different drugs and safer ways of using those drugs.
Massive question really, but in the 30 years since, how have patterns of drug use in the UK changed, and what have been the major developments and what you've been responding to?
Well, things tend to go in cycles anyway. I mean, in the charity that I used to work for in 1971 in Manchester, there was no heroin. I mean, unless you got really lucky when you robbed a dangerous drugs cabinet. Heroin came for a number of complicated reasons, the fall of the Shah of Iran and all kind of like stories like that. And we've seen heroin there has been a constant. We now have a wave of completely new drugs that we've never seen before and growing on a kind of weekly basis. But it's almost like it's come back again, because what we've seen is if you like, a fight back from the traditional drugs, the purity of the... I also do voluntary work in nightclubs in Manchester, doing welfare with people who've partied too hard, as we say. Loads of work with the chemically... What do we used to call it? I can't remember. But anyway, the problem we've got is at the moment what we're seeing is that we're not seeing, apart from specific issues amongst prisoners and homeless populations with synthetic cannabinoids, we're not seeing any NPS, we're not seeing any new drugs to a large extent, because the quality of traditional drugs has never been so high. The market's varied, but you can buy 80% purity cocaine without too much trouble in most English cities at the moment. You'd probably struggle to get 80% pure cocaine in Bolivia. The quality of Mdma at the moment, I mean, about 100, 110 milligrams for a large male is about the kind of desirable dose, according to Alexandra Shulgin. And 10 years ago, you were lucky if you got any Mdma in the pills, and it would have been 10, 20 milligrams. We're regularly getting 200-300 milligram pills. So the problem at the moment is the quality of the drugs. They are just so, they've never had it so good, but they've never had it so dangerous, which are just as dangerous as the adulterants. So we are seeing changes. For instance, I mean, I'm sure we're going to come back to the issue of synthetic cannabinoids, but I did a research project in a town about 15, 20 miles from here called Blackburn a few years ago, where they had a a big synthetic cannabinoid problem because they've got a large, they've disproportionately, they've got a huge number of hostels and houses of multiple occupancy, so people are coming out of prison with bringing the synthetic cannabinoid or spice habit with them. Everybody was kind of like using it. Now they're a few years on from Manchester, and the really scary thing is that those who've given up seem to have gone back to the traditional drugs, and they're getting a heroin problem now. A new lot of heroin users who are not in contact with the, aged 40, 50 plus traditional lot who, we're kind of used to working with. So things come around in cycles. There's just a much bigger menu of drugs than there was 20 years ago on the agenda now. And there are probably less drug users than there were, but I mean, the changes we're seeing are that there are more drugs, that the traditional drugs are much stronger than they've been, certainly in kind of living memory, and that's one of the factors that's led to the record number of drug-related deaths that we've seen in the UK for the last 3 years.
And therefore there's a premium on good information.
Good information, you have to be, I think it's, for the best will in the world, what people often think is if you just tell people that there's, the drugs are really bad, they'll stop using them. That isn't the case. It's very easy to some extent when you get, at the moment we're seeing N-ethyl pentylone, which is a really unusual drug which nobody's really knows that much about, appearing in ecstasy pills. This is in the last few weeks, being sold as ecstasy. Now we have if you like, a bad drug that's being sold as something that people want. It's quite easy to say, don't touch the red pill, use the blue pill to a certain extent. But when you've got a problem like we have at the moment, where you're saying to people, be really, really careful because there's really banging ecstasy out there, be really careful because the cocaine is really, really good, it's a much more difficult problem. And where you've got a situation with daily injecting heroin users, there's research out there that they will welcome really strong, powerful heroin into a particular scene. And if you put out a warning saying, be really careful, the heroin's really, really strong, that you will actively encourage people to go out and kind of like seek it. Bizarrely, one of the issues we had in Manchester with synthetic cannabinoids was that they, because of all the media coverage was Manchester's, going bonkers because the spice is really, really cheap and really, really strong. We started to see rough sleeper tourists coming in from all over the north of England because that sounded, what's not to like if that's your kind of daily drug of choice. So you have to be really careful about how and where you put out those warnings. And what we try and do is we try to be very specific and to put across a consistent message that is a harm reduction message. So at the moment with the heroin and the risk of fentanyl in the heroin, it's very much about promoting the use of take-home naloxone and the kind of measures that we think will actually make a difference in terms of reducing the level of drug-related death.
Just for an international audience, we have this whole subject of new psychoactive substances. We have a question of legality versus illegality. We've gone from spice being a brand name for a particular type of NPS to becoming an umbrella term for a bunch of quite unusual chemicals. Can you just disentangle the whole situation for people who might not be aware that spice use in Manchester particularly, but perhaps right across towns and cities and in prisons has become a very new but unusual problem. Right.
Okay. The UK laws up until quite recently were quite specific in that you had to name a chemical. You could name various analogues of that chemical for it to be classed as an illegal drug, for it to come under the Misuse of Drugs Act. So we had, the very first one was about 10, 15 years ago when there was a loophole found with certain types of psilocybin mushroom. The law was bizarre. If you pick them from they grow all around the countryside around here. If you pick them from the ground and eat them, it's perfectly legal. If you pick from the ground, allow them to dry, it's a Class A drug. So they got around this law by picking them and keeping them in a fridge and arguing that they were fresh. There was a market, and a worldwide kind of market developed then for chemicals that were slightly different from those that were covered by the Misuse of Drugs Act. Methadone was the really big one. That was the really game changer. And that came along in about 2007, 2008, when the quality of cocaine and the quality of Mdma had hit an all-time low. You could buy an ecstasy pill for, 50 pence each. They were so poor. So that came along. It was half the price. It did exactly what it said on the tin. You could get it delivered to your door. You could buy it on the internet, and it was everybody was using it. I mean, I interviewed fat, middle-aged former ravers who were pulling on Smiley T-shirts over their middle-aged beer bellies, who'd suddenly rediscovered their credit card. They didn't know any dealers anymore, but they could kind of like buy it. As I said, I mean, that market for the stimulants has gone because the quality of cocaine and Mdma we've got in this country is so high that nobody would choose to use NPS. The one where it's really stuck is with synthetic cannabinoids. They were initially introduced as a substitute for cannabis. The first one was a brand name called Spice. It was a herb. Usually marshmallow is that they use, which you can buy from Chinese supermarkets in Manchester and mix up in your kind of like bath. And then a powder was imported from China. The original spice contained a chemical called JWH-018. Now this was a chemical that had never been manufactured before, and it's called a synthetic cannabinoid. Not chemically related to THC or CBD or CBN in any way. It just works on the same receptor cells in the brain. Both CB1 and CB2 are those receptor cells. So they're called synthetic cannabinoids, not because they're chemically similar, but they work on the same receptor cells. JWH-018 was relatively mild. So obviously people started to use it, they started to enjoy it. The problem came when the government tried to ban it. So they banned it and said, well, people are using this legal form of spice, we'll bring it under the Misuse of Drugs Act. Within 2 days of them banning it, it was replaced, the chemical that they were ordering from China and using in the shops, by a whole range of other synthetic cannabinoids, which were in some cases 10 or 20 times more potent. One of the famous ones that replaced it had a brand name of Black Mamba, and it contained a synthetic cannabinoid called AM2201. I could be making all these names up, by the way. They're totally irrelevant. It doesn't really matter in some kind of like ways. So the product started to become stronger and stronger and stronger. And as opposed to being a substitute for cannabis, it became a different drug in its own right. So the market was was going for the strongest one that you could possibly get. So stronger and stronger, more potent synthetic cannabinoids were used, and also the ratio. So it isn't just about the synthetic cannabinoid you use, it's how much of the synthetic cannabinoid powder is mixed in with the marshmallow or other plant material. So they got stronger and stronger until they were more akin to a ketamine-like dissociative experience than anything to do with heroin. The government then tried to ban those substances again, and they were again replaced within 2 days in the shop by substances which were not only stronger, but were much harder to make, so they had to use a solvent in the kind of the sort of like process, so they were more dangerous. But they were incredibly cheap. You could buy them in bulk for £5 a gram. Now they were used by a wide variety of people, but like all drug problems, the problem went to the traditional people who experience drug problems, who tick all the boxes of things that have gone wrong in their life, and it ended up in jail. Partly because cannabis was easily detected, other drugs were easily detected within that system by testing, and the forms of spice they were using weren't covered by the Misuse of Drugs Act. But it changed. I went into one particular jail every year for about 8 years to interview people about the changing face of spice. And it went from a kind of way of people saying, we're only using this while we're in prison, we'll go back to using weed or cannabis on the outside, and you don't get that anymore. What they say is, why on earth would you go back to cannabis when this stuff is much cheaper and is much, much stronger and is a very different drug? And quite apart from that, you can't feel the effects of cannabis when you've been using synthetic cannabinoids for a while, because they're just so potent. It takes a while to kind of get it back. So the situation we've got now is we had the introduction of a brand new law in this country in 2016 called the Psychoactive Substances Act, where any substance that can get you high basically is illegal, even if it's not been invented yet. I know. It's with obviously the exception of alcohol and tobacco, the drugs that kill the most people. But the law is even more bizarre than that. So there has to be an intention for it's not illegal to possess these substances. It's illegal to sell them, and you can go to prison for up to 7 years. So nitrous oxide is a really good case in point. Nitrous oxide is one of the most popular party drugs. So people buy the little canisters of nitrous oxide. If the shopkeeper sells it so that you can make whipped cream for custard pies, if you're a clown, that's perfectly legal. But if he sells it with the intention of you using it to get high, which obviously every shopkeeper in the world can spot the wily drug user and spot why they're trying to get high, then he could go to jail up to about 7 years. So it's a really bizarre and complicated law. But what it did do, it closed down all the visible outlets who were openly selling shops who were selling all these drugs that weren't covered by the Misuse of Drugs Act. The research I did in Blackburn, they closed all the head shops and outlets that were selling it. And within 2 days, this had been taken up by someone who was a multi-commodity dealer who opened up 2 Facebook sites. All of his friends were 15-year-olds who were in children's homes and things like that. They would deliver anywhere within the area within 15 minutes. The price went down and the potency went up. So we knew that it wouldn't work. We knew that it would close the visible outlets, and that was the intention of this new act, because they had to be seen to be doing something. But in terms of what it did to supply, we're now in a situation where it's the number one drug in all prisons in the country. It's the nature of it, I think, of synthetic cannabinoid use is useful to think of it as infectious. So I would go round to children's homes and you would find nobody who was using it. You'd go around to another children's home and everybody was using it. Some of the outlet that were selling on the internet and delivering also run a close for cash outlet as well. So all the bedding and towels from the children's homes got swapped for synthetic cannabinoids. All the clothes donated to homeless populations got swapped and kind of like things like that as well. So the situation we've got at the moment is that outside of prisons, hostels, homeless places, houses of multiple occupancy and amongst rough sleepers, you really haven't got a large NPS problem. It isn't a major issue, apart from fentanyl, which we can kind of maybe come on to. Yeah. But within those populations, it's taken over and there's the number one drug. And is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Probably a bad thing, and it's an extremely dangerous drug. There were 58 ambulance call-outs in one day in Manchester in the summer last year. Collapsing has become normal. It's highly addictive. There are lots of things that have started to be recorded about the long-term use of it, which are really disturbing. And there are lots of others, like people quite often are talking about bleeding from the eyeballs and things like that, which are not actually recorded in the literature, which are obviously disturbing. But in terms of, is it killing people? No, it's not. Is it spreading HIV and bloodborne viruses like hepatitis C? No, it's not, because people, touch wood, aren't injecting it in this country at the moment. They released the drug-related death figures about a month or so ago, and there were no deaths which were solely attributable to synthetic cannabinoids in the UK. There were 28 where it was mentioned in a coroner's report along with other drugs. Now, where you compare that to the 2,500 deaths we've seen and rising, most of those being heroin users, most of those being 40-plus heroin users as well. As I said, you're less likely to die, but in terms of, is it a problem? Yes, it is. Why do people use it? The same reason that any other, it's not a coincidence that it's people in prison, rough sleepers, etc., who are using the drug. And the research that's been done where you ask them why, quite often it's to cope with being in prison, rough sleeping, etc., etc. Exactly the same reason why, any other drug is kind of used in those circumstances.
It's possibly worth amplifying that. It's very hard, and when we've done coverage of the whole issue, it's very hard to find people that users that even like the thing in the first instance. There's a sort of unanimous feeling of hate for this substance, and yet demand remains high.
Yeah, it's bang per buck. It's really, as I said, incredibly addictive, but it's really cheap, and what we're finding is that the actual synthetic cannabinoid added to the spice mixture changes quite rapidly. We had a situation a few months ago where we had this zombie spice which became international headlines because people were kind of like frozen in the street, and the fact that it's visible to the general population is a massive issue. If it was happening in some, excuse my French, but shit-arse housing estate, nobody would really care. It's the fact that it's visible, it's in the city centre, that is really important. Now, we got involved with the early warning system with that and found that nobody was actually testing it. So we tested it, and that was a synthetic cannabinoid called AMB fubinaca. As I said, completely meaningless, these names, other than the fact that that had been associated with similar behaviour in New York the previous summer. Now, it's changed. It's for another meaningless name. It's 5-FADB, which is the kind of current one that's being used. But the thing about it changing is that you quickly build a tolerance to smoking a particular brand of spice, a particular synthetic cannabinoid, where when you're a first-time user, you get all the hallucinations, you get the, taken to another reality. And after that, it's more like a kind of, a heroin gouge is a lot of people kind of describe it as is the effect you get. But there doesn't appear to be a cross tolerance. So when the synthetic cannabinoid within that spice changes, you go back to the collapse and the falling over and those kind of effects again. So that kind of matters.
And the stories are that amongst many of the rough sleepers who use spice, it's sort of changed social relations between them. There've been reports, sensational or not, about aggression where previously there was cooperation between people and so on. Is that realistic, or is that just headline stuff?
Probably a bit of both. I mean, it's very difficult to get kind of evidence of does this make people aggressive compared to what heroin's. In some ways, if you were going to pick a drug for a homeless population to use, you'd kind of tick heroin as at the top of the box in terms that it's antipsychotic. It's you're not going to a lot of kind of positive things, which is why it was kind of like used. Synthetic cannabinoids are certainly psychotic, probably more so than stimulants or even heavier cannabis in terms of bringing on those kind of episodes. But I've heard enough reports of people talking about changed behaviour and violence kicking off. For instance, when I did the research in Blackburn's quite it's a bit of a drinkers' town, like many towns in the north of England, and they have a police station based in the A&E department all the time for when people kick off after they've been drinking. And I interviewed the police officers there and who'd been dealing with both the people who'd been brought in an ambulance after using spice and drinkers. And I said, well, is it any worse than drinking? And they all said yes. They said every single person we've come across has kicked off. And I know there'd been incidents with staff in homeless services in Manchester of a kind of similar kind. So there does seem to be something specific. Nobody really knows what, where, changes in behaviour, changes in kind of like, this very aggressive, violent behaviour does seem to be associated with it. There isn't enough evidence, yes, but if you ask my opinion based on what I've heard, yes, I think that is the case. Yeah.
And that lack of research or knowledge at the moment means there's implications for treatment of people or services for people, both in the short term and the long term, presumably.
It's up to a point. I mean, there's in this country there's a really good thing called Project Neptune, which is there are about I think there are about 200 or 300 different doctors and academics who got together and sort of said, well, let's look at both the best practice and research evidence on MPS and publish, which are updated all the time, guidelines for treatment. And Project Neptune, which is all available free online, have actually published all the guidelines on treatment and various things you can do with synthetic cannabinoids. So there isn't a substitute that will bring people in like there is with heroin, where you can give them Subutex or methadone. But there is treatment. Most of the treatment involves managing the physical withdrawal symptoms that people often describe, mainly with the use of benzodiazepines. There is some indications there about using antipsychotic medication in some kind of like cases, but it's not true to say there isn't a treatment for it. In terms of the specific research point about finding out what causes what, it's incredibly difficult because it's not one product. There are hundreds of different synthetic cannabinoids. One may be far more dangerous than another, but in terms of treatment, there is treatment out there. The problem seems to be that people don't want to access that treatment. Part of it may be a belief in that they don't think there's a treatment that's going to be effective, but there's a lot of people I've spoken to who have said, well, you can't separate out one from the other. You can't separate out the condition of being a rough sleeper from the drugs that you use. The two are intertwined. You can't treat one without the other, which has always been the case. Yeah. I kind of know. So the treatment for kind of treatment is, again, there's no evidence, but what they're recommending is the same kind of interventions you would use with heavy cannabis use. But as I say, it's the problem in that it's in these specific populations, and these populations are using that particular drug to cope with the condition that they're in, to get through the night, all those kind of like reasons. So you need a holistic, this is, I'm sure all of you know this, but you need a holistic solution where you can't solve one without the other.
There's an assumption abroad that it's a linear route from drug use into homelessness or rough sleeping, but as you say, it's much more complicated.
Absolutely, I mean
that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean I've done 3 or 4 different research projects with homeless populations in Manchester and in various other countries, threatening with arrest over one of them. Again,
why?
Because I devised a pizza box to give out for people who are injecting in informal shooting galleries, and we imported all the injection equipment, including the heroin cookers from France, before the ACMD had agreed that they would be a good idea. So they threatened to arrest us, and we fought them. We stood up to them, and in the end they personally threatened to arrest me for giving out a book of matches, which could be used under Section 9A of the Misuse of Drugs Act as drugs paraphernalia, but I never took them seriously. But anyway, my point about that was, you meet hundreds and thousands of drug users in a kind of long career like this, and there are always some people who stick in your mind, and one of them who stuck in my mind was a particular woman who'd come in. Her face had been really badly scarred with a broken bottle, which she said her boyfriend / pimp had taught her a lesson, the way she described it. She'd had both her children taken off her. Both her parents had been heroin users. She'd watched her father die as a heroin user. She was HIV positive. She'd spent most of her life in prison or in some kind of care from the state. She was a sex worker as well. And it was freezing cold. And she was going out onto the streets in really flimsy clothes to sell her body to pay for the next batch of heroin. And I kind of thought, well, if I was her, it's a logical decision to use heroin. If I'm going to be sleeping on that, not only do you not feel the cold, but heroin's a painkiller. It kills the physical and emotional pain of your life, what you're going to have to do, to survive. Yes, heroin's probably one of the reasons that's keeping her there and stopping her from getting out of that kind of situation. But it was a logical decision, and that kind of always struck me as, it's not daft to use drugs when you're in that situation. It makes absolutely perfect sense.
So what away from spice, and you touch on heroin use, we and a lot of the US people here will be aware of the synthetic opioid issue. Mm-hmm. Is that becoming one of the current trends in the UK?
Possibly. We're nowhere near on a scale of the United States and Canada at the moment. There's been an increase in the number of fentanyl deaths. I say fentanyl, there are very few, there are a few people who get hold of fentanyl patches from the NHS, but it's nearly always one of the analogues. It's about 40 odd analogues have been identified by the European Union. So there are some people who deliberately, who are drug bugs, who deliberately, buy it on the internet and use it, and some of those have been a few of those deaths, not a huge number. And we had the first case about 3 months ago where heroin was being sold with fentanyl added to it, including carfentanil, which is by far the most potent of the fentanyls that are around. So that's the fear, and the problem is one of the factors that's probably keeping fentanyl at bay at the moment is the fact that the heroin is really good. We 40% purity is quite normal with the heroin supplies in the UK. You can go even higher than that. Obviously varies a lot. But if we get another heroin drought like we did in 2010, where the heroin drops down to nothing, fentanyl is just going to be everywhere. So on top of an ageing population with all the problems that the health kind of problems and the risk factors that brings, and on top of 3 years running of record drug-related deaths that disproportionately, they're nearly all middle-aged heroin users amongst that. If we suddenly get fentanyl as well, we're in big trouble. The good thing, I think, about that is that there are a number of factors that are kind of preventative within that. By a country mile, the most effective one is the provision of take-home naloxone. So the take-home naloxone programs are being pushed at the moment to try and make an impact in the drug-related deaths from traditional opiates, and that would be exactly the same with the kind of like fentanyls anyway. So yes, it's a real concern. We're not seeing it on the scale we've seen in the United States, but that's a real big worry. And also conversely, along with other things I've mentioned as well, if you bang on about it too much in the media and go on about it, you will also attract people to use who want actively seek out and kind of use it anyway. So a bit of a tricky one. Yeah.
Last question really before I open up to questions from the floor, but you've got 30 years experience and perspective, and you've got a policy wish list regarding drugs. What's on that wish list, and does that include legalisation, decriminalisation?
Yeah, I think. I mean, decriminalising drugs is not going to solve all the drug problems, obviously, any more so than having a legalised alcohol market will do. But yes, I mean, if you had an ideal world, I mean, you would grow specific strains of traditional cannabis that were high in CBD, that were probably, well, not probably, there's fairly good research evidence which are antipsychotic, that you could, sell to people with psychiatric problems who, got kind of like psychosis, who are using strains high in THC at the moment. There are a lot of practical ways you can think of doing it. You still end up with the dilemmas. I mean, it's the same way, if you like, the kind of criticism that, in this country about 5-6 years ago, the recovery movement kind of wiped the floor with a lot of the traditional harm reduction, certainly in terms of the media. And a lot of that was on the back of, we don't want your free drugs from the NHS. I mean, after moaning for 20 years, it's actually exactly what they wanted. We don't want you. We want to give up. We want to build our lives. Well, fair and good, but the policy of giving out free drugs on the NHS is incredibly difficult. Politically, it's difficult. It's difficult within the constrained budgets. So if you've got, for instance, rough sleepers who haven't got the money to go and pay in a regulated market to afford the drugs that they're paying for, do you give them drugs for free on the NHS? At what point do you give them the free drugs? The first time they've used, after they've been using for 10, So it doesn't solve the world's problems, but, the system we've got at the moment, as I'm sure most people who looked at it will agree, makes it much worse. So it would be better in a lot of ways, but you wouldn't get rid of the problems.
Great, thank you. Sure, we've got some questions from the floor after that.
Hi, I'm the interpreter for Fernando. So I'm just speaking in the first person, like if I was Fernando. I'm from Uruguay, and a couple of months ago, cannabis became legalized, so you can buy it in pharmacies. So I just want to know if you heard about this and what your opinion was, or any ideas.
Yes, I've certainly heard about it. I think it makes perfect sense, and it is better than the system we've got at the moment. It wouldn't solve all the problems, but it would certainly, the criminalisation of drugs doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't help the situation. So having a regulated, controlled market would not be an ideal world, but would be a better world than we've got at the moment.
From what you said, you suggested that the criminalisation of spice, or making it illegal, made the situation much worse because the people manufacturing it then made much stronger drugs. Wouldn't that have happened anyway?
Possibly, and if you hadn't have brought in drug testing in prison 20 years ago and you'd allow people to smoke cannabis to start off with, you wouldn't have had a spice problem. Yes. You know, you can see why they wanted to do something, because it was a drug that was causing genuine problems, and it was so in your face in terms of shops being able to sell it, that they had to act and had to do something. But was it going to make the situation worse or better for those people who had a real problem with it? It was obvious that it was going to make it worse, and I mean, I gave evidence to the ACMD before they took these decisions, and gave them the results of the research that I'd done in Blackburn. Their hands were tied. They didn't really have much kind of like choice to do it. So whenever you're talking about a policy with drugs, you're dealing with two things. You're dealing with, well, what can we do that will improve the situation or make the situation better, or better than what we're doing at the moment. But the thing that always overrides that is the morality of it. So you're dealing with public morality at all times. So, you know, as I mentioned, the morality of, you know, me saying, well, I understand why people are smoking spice if they're living rough in the city centre, is dealt with by the morality of people walking along and actually seeing it in some kind of like way, and the newspapers getting hold of it. So policies is much about dealing with that morality, dealing with, you know, as I said, I've been threatened with arrest on numerous occasions and dealt with, you know, been told by the Daily Mail that I was a threat to the youth of Britain, which obviously I had printed on a T-shirt and walked around in. But you have to, if you like, kind of fight that morality, and I don't think you'll ever win that. In some ways, successful policy sometimes kind of goes under the radar and kind of skips that, certainly in this country, skips that morality rather than standing on a soapbox saying we do this and we do that it kind of slips in. Rather like the law, you know, you could have an argument about the good and bad of pornography, but, you know, the internet has changed the world forever. There was no big song and dance about, you know, do we have dirty, smutty shops where you have to go in a raincoat and buy them anymore? They had to deal with the reality, and it kind of, without debating it, the laws were kind of brushed under the carpet and kind of changed in some ways. So you're always dealing with that kind of mixture of policy and morality.
Maybe it's a stupid question, but why is the quality of the heroin so good at the moment? Is it because there are so many other drugs that are available?
Oh, if I had £1 for every theory about that, I think that the best answer is that nobody really knows. You can probably find half a dozen UN experts on the situation in Afghanistan who will give you diagrams of crop charts and regions of Afghanistan or where they're growing and kind of like things like that. I don't think anybody knows. The crop in Afghanistan, where our major supplies seem to come from, something went wrong in 2010 and we had a massive great heroin drought. Since then, the supplies have come back to, you know, what were traditional levels kind of before that. There are always new smuggling routes that are being developed, the Interpol or somebody busts. There's always stories about the crops either a record high or a record low or something like that. It doesn't seem to make any difference to the drugs on the street. The reason why some of the other drugs are higher, we know a little bit more about. The quality of cocaine, far-fetched as it seems, the best story I've heard is that the United Nations or the local government or somebody tried to pay the FARC guerrillas to get rid of their coca production based on so much money per hectare. So obviously they all started growing massive amounts so they would get paid to get rid of it, which is one of the reasons why we've had a surplus over here. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's the best story I've kind of heard. The quality of MDMA is basically to do with they found a new way of manufacturing it. The quality dipped in the 90s because Interpol went after the precursor chemicals, the chemicals you'd need to manufacture ecstasy. And they basically found a new way of making it, if you like, a precursor to a precursor. So the Dutch are now, in the shipyards of Gdansk are now kind of competing to who can get the strongest MDMA, because the precursor chemicals are fairly easy to get hold of and they can just make it stronger and stronger and stronger. And of course, the internet has changed everything in terms of finding out about drugs and delivery methods of drugs and, bulk buying it, etc., etc.
I found that a lot of homeless people that we work with or see on the streets across the UK who have drug use, there used to be a long waiting list for people to get on a script, so people would be looking about 6 months or something like that, unless they broke the law. That now seems to be a lot quicker, so people can get on a script quite easily. What I found to be a really obvious thing that's a problem is they get people clean, and then they have to wait 6 months to a year before there's any help with mental health issues. So we get people clean. They've been using for a long time to mask the trauma that they've experienced early on in life. And then there's not enough quick support to deal with that. Is that anything you've had experience with, knowledge on, thoughts on?
Yeah, it's been a problem that has been debated for the last 30 years. And what I found in the research I did on NPS in Blackburn was that when you had a new drug come along, it highlighted all the traditional fault lines. So is this a drug, do they go to the drug service? Do they go to the mental health service? That kind of thing shouldn't be happening, because this has been, it's not a secret, this has been 30 years, there's been conferences about, we've got it all sorted out now, but it is still an issue. Part of that may just be down to the fact that there's cuts everywhere and there's no money anywhere for kind of services. But as a part of it is down to the fact that we just can't seem to sort this out, even 30 years kind of later. But yes, it's a massive issue. What the recent policy is that what they've said is that they set up a number of specialist dual diagnosis services. They seem to have abandoned that, and they see it as a kind of generic problem where everybody should kind of deal with that kind of separately. So I recognise it. It's a long-term problem, and I don't see anybody solving it straight away.
Well, I think if there's no more questions, in which case I'm sure we'd all like to thank Michael Linnell for a very fascinating, very revealing, very informative session. Thank you very much indeed.